Hello, comrades, and welcome to today's O'Malley Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman O'Malley Yesatella. My name is Kobina. I am the Southern Regional Representative for the African People's Socialist Party from Huntsville, Alabama, and I'll be your MC for this morning. Today's study is a continuation of a special series where Chairman takes us through each chapter of the political report to the 7th Congress, which is taking place October the 6th through the 12th, right here in St. Louis, Missouri. This week, the chairman will be reading part 2 of chapter 10, titled The African Nation. This chapter also appears in chairman's book, The Uneasy Equilibrium, which served as the political report to the 6th Congress, and yet this chapter remains relevant today. The question of the African nation is central to the liberation of Africa and all Africans everywhere. This question being resolved by the African People's Socialist Party is the reason why Africans hailing from all over will descend on St. Louis for our 7th Congress. For the past 50 years, Chairman O'Malley Yesatella has worked to build an organization with one of the primary objectives being to unify Africa and African people no matter where we have been dispersed through colonialism. In this chapter, the chairman will deliver a powerful reading of part 2, which will serve to deepen our own political understanding of the question of the nation. Following the reading, we will open it up for questions and answers, where we will have an opportunity to comment and ask questions pertaining to this chapter specifically. We ask you to write your questions as you think of them so that we are able to take them following the reading. We will also encourage that when you comment your questions, you state your location for us so we can see where everyone is watching from. It is now my honor to introduce the leader of the African nation himself, Chairman O'Malley Yesatella. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Africa. This is the last chapter of the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party that will be happening in St. Louis, where I'm currently located, from October 6th through the 12th. I just want to remind us that this reading is a part of a process that prepares us for the 7th Congress. It is an aspect of the democratic component of what we call democratic centralism that allows us to carry on as our Constitution requires, with a discussion beginning at least 3 months prior to our Congress of the political report, so that all the membership will have an opportunity to familiarize yourself with the report, to be able to come to this Congress prepared to discuss it, to critique it, to criticize it, to be able to make an intelligent and informed vote on the adoption of this report as the position of the African People's Socialist Party, not only here in the U.S., but throughout the world. So this is not just a process of sharing thoughts, but it is a part of the democratic component of the political organization, the African People's Socialist Party, and preparation for our 7th Congress. I look forward to seeing everybody there. I'm sure that most of you have already made your plans and got your tickets and found your housing and what have you, made your reservations to be here. So I look forward for all of you, and I'm hoping that all of you who have not registered for the Congress at this point will go ahead and do that on today. Do it now. So this is the second half of the last chapter that we will be entertaining in this political report. Excuse me, please. So we're beginning in the document that I have. It is on page 250. And I know most of us are reading from a draft of the political report. It will, by the time of the Congress, have been copy edited again, proofed again, and even within the days following that Congress will be prepared for publication in book form. This was not the extent of our discussion on the nation in the political report to our fifth Congress. Then as now, we were engaged in serious struggle with the ossified notions that have hampered and misdirected our struggle since the political defeat of the Universal Negro Improvement Association led by Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. At that time, the struggle for African national consolidation, though seriously debated, was essentially being advanced by the program of the UNIA with its membership of 11 million Africans around the world and the slogan of Africa for Africans at home and abroad. Since its founding in 1919, the Communist Party USA had joined with an assortment of African liberals and the U.S. government in hounding Garvey because of the UNIA's position on the African nation. In 1928, a resolution of the Sixth Communist International held in Moscow admitted that Africans constituted a separate nation inside the U.S., just as the now deported Marcus Garvey had explicitly stated all along. The Communist Party USA was forced to reluctantly comply with this position. This came after the CPUSA, NAACP, and others had eagerly promoted and united with the U.S. government's attack, imprisonment, and deportation of Garvey to Jamaica, the island of his birth. The Comintern's position on the Negro question suggested that Africans were a nation within a contrived national homeland in the Black Belt South of the U.S. This manufactured nation of sorts, as described in the Negro question, was designed to take advantage of the obvious national consciousness among the African population in the U.S., influenced by the successful Garvey movement that the CPUSA helped to destroy. The CPUSA attempted to infiltrate the UNIA with undercover communist organizers. As we stated in African Internationalism versus Pan-Africanism, presented at the conference to build the African Socialist International held in London in 2005, and printed in my book, One Africa, One Nation, the Communist Party did not address the fact that our homeland had been taken away from us, and we from it, which is what Africans were responding to by joining the Garvey movement. The CPUSA Black Belt South position, moreover, completely obscures the fact that the land of what is now called North and South America, including the Black Belt South, was stolen by Europeans from the indigenous people in the same genocidal process that brought about the birth of parasitic capitalism and the consolidation of the white nation. The indigenous people continue to suffer the consequences of this assault even today. This land belongs to the indigenous people. The CPUSA's position, nevertheless, implicitly recognizes the commonality of national interests linking Africans worldwide. This passage is one example of that. And we shall quote, "The Negro race everywhere is an oppressed race, whether it is a minority, USA, etc., majority, South Africa, or inhabits a so-called independent state, Liberia, etc. The Negroes are oppressed by imperialism. Thus, a common tie of interest is established for the revolutionary struggle of race and national liberation from imperialist domination of the Negroes in various parts of the world." So here's what they have done. This is the position of the Communist Party, the Communist International. This is a part of the resolution that they adopted. You got to remember, these are the persons who united with the United States government and an assortment of other forces in fighting against the Garvey movement and actually jailing Garvey because of the position on Africans being one nation. So here's what they've done. If you read this, just this paragraph here, this excerpt here, and substitute Africa for Negro, and it goes, the Negro race here is an oppressed race, whether it is a minority, USA, majority, South Africa, or inhabits a so-called independent state, Liberia, etc. The Negroes are oppressed by imperialism. So all of us are Negroes. We can be Negroes, all of us, but we can't be Africans. This is the logic that drives this position. They have defined us as having a common interest as long as we are Negroes. It's the point where we say that we are Africans, or that we, and they've already said we are a distinct group but now this group is called Negroes. This is the position of the Communist International. The 1928 Communist International Resolution on the Negro question became the template for succeeding positions on the question by various Marxist, communists, and an assortment of black nationalists, some of whom were not communists and sometimes even anti-communist in their outlook. One of the most influential advocates of this position before his defection from the Communist International to the ranks of Pan-African anti-communism was George Padmore. Padmore was a well-known Trinidad-born activist who penned an authoritative book titled The Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers that was published by a section of the Communist International in 1931. Like the entire worldwide Marxist movement that made up the Communist International, Padmore was a rabid, visceral anti-Garveyite. The introduction to Padmore's 1931 work, written during the Great Depression, could have been easily written today considering the current economic crisis. Whether intentional or not, Padmore's book exposes his own opportunism and that of the Communist International that he represented. Padmore uses all the evidence that supports Garvey's efforts to organize the liberation of the African nation as the basis for joining and celebrating the attacks on Garvey. It was attacks such as these that helped to destroy Garvey's extraordinary anti-imperialist movement for the happiness and material well-being of African people. Padmore's introduction inadvertently supports our party's position concerning the commonality of African conditions and interests internationally, our common national identity, its class character, and the African national territory that helps to define us as the nation, though dispersed. Here's Padmore. This is George Padmore we're quoting now. It has been estimated that there are about 250 million Negroes in the world. The vast majority of these peoples are workers and peasants. They are scattered throughout various geographical territories. The bulk of them, however, still live on the continent of Africa, the original home of the black race. There are nevertheless large populations of Negroes in the New World. For instance, there are about 15 millions in the United States, 10 millions in Brazil, 10 millions in the West Indies, and 5 to 7 millions in various Latin American countries such as Colombia, Honduras, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc., etc. The oppression of Negroes assumes two distinct forms. On the one hand, they are oppressed as a class, and on the other as a nation. This national and race oppression has its base in the social economic relation of the Negro under capitalism. National, and in parentheses, race oppression assumes its most pronounced forms in the United States of America, especially in the black belt of the southern states where lynching, peonage, Jim Crowism, political disenfranchisement, and social ostracism is widespread. And in the Union of South Africa, where the blacks, who form the majority of the entire population, have been robbed of their lands and are segregated on reserves, enslaved in compounds, and subjected to the vilest form of anti-labor and racial laws, poll, hut, pass, taxes, and color bar system in industry. The general conditions under which Negroes live, either as a national, race group, or as a class, form one of the most degrading spectacles of bourgeois civilization. Since the present crisis of world capitalism began, the economic, political, and social status of the Negro toilers are becoming ever worse and worse. The reason for this is obvious. The imperialists, whether American, English, French, Belgium, etc., are frantically trying to find a way out of their difficulties. In order to do so, they are not only intensifying the exploitation of the white workers in the various imperialist countries by launching an offensive through means of rationalization, wage cuts, abolition of social insurance, unemployment, etc., but they are turning their attention more and more towards Africa and other black semi-colonies, Haiti, Liberia, which represent the last stronghold of world imperialism. In this way, the bourgeoisie hope to unload the major burden of the crisis on the back of on the black colonial and semi-colonial masses. Padmore's introduction continues to assert, it is also necessary for the workers of the capitalist countries to understand that it is only through the exploiting of the colonial workers from whose sweat and blood super profits are extorted that the imperialists are able to bribe the reformers and social fascist trade union bureaucrats and thereby enable them to betray the struggles of the workers, unquote. This is Padmore. This passage is laden with all kinds of obvious contradictions that I won't try to belabor right now, but possibly we'll get to look at some of them as we begin to sum up. There are a number of erroneous assumptions found in Padmore's words. It is clear that he does not recognize that capitalism was born as parasitic, that capitalism was born as parasitic white power that liberated the European bourgeoisie and working class from the fetters of the feudal social system. He does not understand that this occurred at the expense of Africans and the oppressed of the world, that are overturning that historical relationship at the very moment of this at our party's at the time 6th Congress. Capitalism represented progress only for European development, for the workers, the bourgeoisie, and society in general. Padmore does not explain why the imperialists would try to, quote unquote, find their way out of their difficulties, unquote, by turning their attention more and more towards Africa and other black semi-colonies. Of course, for African internationalist 21st century Garvey, the answer is simple. It is the raw, terror-laden exploitation of Africa upon which the entire imperialist edifice rests. What Padmore warns the white workers about, the super profits coming from the colonies, is normal capitalist function. There is nothing super about these profits. The thing that may make the profits appear to be super is simply the fact that white workers, as part of the white nation, share in the imperialist exploitation of the rest of us. The concept of super profits muddies the fact that the vast majority of Africans and other colonized people, workers, constitute the true base of capitalist exploitation and always have. The fact that the level of profit extraction from this relationship is normal. White workers achieve a greater return for the value of their labor power because they exist as a part of a parasitic nation that originates from parasitic capitalism stemming from slavery and colonialism. so-called super profits infer an exceptional level of exploitation. However, it is the white or European oppressor nation worker that experiences the exceptional relationship with capitalism. Ours is not an exceptional relationship. It is the norm. It is the European oppressor nation worker that experiences a super relationship with capitalism that is revealed in the different conditions of existence experienced by European workers and the rest of us. I don't know if that's clear to everybody. Because this is a concept you hear bandied about all the time by Marxists and socialists and so-called communists. This whole question of super exploitations of Africans and the rest of us. But the fact of the matter is, if you live in a world where 80% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive of less than $10 a day, and then another 50% are trying to survive of $2.50 or less a day, and Africa, where one is lucky to get $1 a day, you can't say that you're talking about super profits, you're talking about the norm. What is super in terms of the relationship with capitalism is what white people get, this minority. And this is one of the problems we're confronted with, is that the world is defined from the perspective of this minority population. It dominates the entire world. You can't call that super profits. It's normal profits. It's the normal profits of capitalism that stems from this parasitic relationship that the European nation and capital have with Africans and the rest of the colonized people. Anyway, Padmore's concern about the reformers and social fascist trade union bureaucrats is also misdirected. While reformism certainly is a problem, when it comes to the issue within the European white nation, the real question is opportunism, the tendency to sacrifice the long-term interests of the struggle against imperialism rooted in the colonial question for the short-term interests of white workers, which can be served at the expense of the rest of us, something the white working class as a social force has never hesitated to do. And this whole question of super profit functions also to cover the question of opportunism. Perhaps the root of Padmore's opposition to Garvey and true African national liberation can be found in his characterization of social ostracism. This is something that he talked about, Africans experiencing social ostracism. Perhaps the root of Padmore's opposition to Garvey and true African national liberation can be found in his characterization of social ostracism as one of the oppressive consequences defining the conditions of existence of Africans colonized within the U.S. The question is social ostracism from whom? The issue of social ostracism only concerns those whose interest is in integrating, assimilating into the social domain of the white oppressor nation, not those who recognize their interest in liberation of the African nation. So here's Padmore crying because he's been ostracized, or because Africans are ostracized, that is to say, kept out of the white society. And the contradiction not is that Africans are kept out of white society, but that white society resides, exists on top of the exploitation and the ripoff of Africa and the rest of the world. The thing is not to cease the ostracism from them, but to overturn this relationship. I hope this is clear. This struggle for black or African national independence is usually called black separatism, a subjective response by whites who never speak of the Declaration of Independence proclaiming the establishment of the U.S. bourgeois state on stolen indigenous land as a declaration of separation. However, it is in the section of his book titled Revolutionary Perspectives that Padmore unleashes the full force of his venom on Garvey and the struggle for African national emancipation. According to Padmore, we quote, "The struggle against Garveyism represents one of the major tasks of the Negro toilers in America and the African and West Indian colonies. I want to read that again. The struggle against Garveyism represents one of the major tasks of the Negro toilers in America and the African and West Indian colonies. So this is the time where Africans living on the worst kind of colonialism all over the world were being lynched, murdered, etc. But the struggle against Garveyism, according to Padmore, is one of the major tasks. Not to end the lynching, not to overturn Jim Crowism, not to get paid for the value of stolen labor, not to end things like this new form of slavery called convict leasing, but to fight Garvey. And to go back to Padmore, why must we struggle against Garveyism? As the program of the Communist International correctly states, Garveyism is a dangerous ideology which bears not a single democratic trait. We say that self-determination is the highest expression of democracy. And the Garvey movement was the highest expression of the struggle for self-determination. But according to Padmore, he says that we must struggle against Garveyism because, as the program of the Communist International correctly states, Garveyism is a dangerous ideology which bears not a single democratic trait and which toys with the aristocratic attributes of a non-existent Negro kingdom. It must be strongly resisted, for it is not a help but a hindrance to the mass Negro struggle for liberation against American imperialism. Garvey is more than a dishonest demagogue who, taking advantage of the revolutionary wave of protests of the Negro toilers against imperialist oppression and exploitation, was able to crystallize a mass movement in America in the years immediately after the war. His dishonesty and fraudulent business schemes, such as the Black Star Line, through which he extorted millions and millions of dollars out of the sweat of the Negro working class, soon led to his imprisonment. After his release, Garvey was deported back to Jamaica, his native country. Isolated from the main body of the organization, Garvey has been unable to maintain his former autocratic control of the movement, as a result of which there has been a complete disintegration of the organization, which is now under the control of a number of warring factional leaders. Padmore continues, quote, despite the bankruptcy of the Garvey movement, the ideology of Garveyism, which is the most reactionary expression in Negro bourgeois nationalism, still continues to exert some influence among certain sections of the Negro masses. The black landlords and capitalists who support Garveyism are merely trying to mobilize the Negro workers and peasants to support them in establishing a Negro republic in Africa where they would be able to set themselves up as the rulers in order to continue the exploitation of the toilers of their race, free from white imperialist competition. In its class content, Garvey is alien to the interests of the Negro toilers. Like Zionism and Gandhiism, it is merely out to utilize the racial and national consciousness for the purpose of promoting the class interests of the black bourgeoisie and landlords. In order to further their own aims, the leaders of Garveyism have attempted to utilize the same demagogic methods of appeal used by the leaders of Zionism. For example, the promise of Back to Africa, behind which slogan Garvey attempts to conceal the truly imperialist aims of the Negro bourgeoisie, unquote. We have been generous in the space given Padmore because he is one of the best representatives of this backward view on the struggle for African national liberation that poses as progressive. It is clear that without intending to do so, Padmore validates Garvey's position when he says, quote unquote, the oppression of Negroes assumes two distinct forms. On the one hand, they oppress as a class, and on the other as a nation. unquote. However, echoing many of the written attacks on Garvey by W.E.B. Du Bois, Padmore goes on to manufacture conclusions about Garvey's intentions that cannot be substantiated by science and rely solely on clearly prejudiced subjective rantings. It is instructive that Padmore's great fear is the imperialist aims of the so-called imperialist aims of the Garvey movement at a time when there were only two nominally independent countries on the continent of Africa, and the entire African world was locked in the stranglehold of white colonial slavery. So Padmore is talking about Garvey's imperialist intentions. This is extraordinary. When the only two nominal, that is in name only, independent African so-called states in the whole world were Ethiopia and Liberia. Everything else, and even these entities were under the indirect control of white power, but his fear is the imperialist designs of the Garvey movement, of the movement of Marcus Garvey, somebody based in Harlem, New York. It borders on insanity that Padmore's fears would be directed at an alleged intent of Garvey to create a black imperialism in Africa that would, in fact, overturn a real existing white imperialism. Stop Garvey and his imperialist intent that, if successful, would overturn a real white existing imperialism. You don't have to guess about what white imperialism will do, except it exists. It is dominating the whole world, and it is what created Marcus Garvey and his movement. The movement to stop Garvey, of which Padmore was an illustrious participant, was in reality a movement to protect white imperialist domination of Africa from African people ourselves. It is clear how Padmore's position against Garvey mirrors that of the white ruling class, blaming Garvey for the imperialist attacks that were responsible for Garvey's imprisonment and deportation, as well as the destruction of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, events that Padmore gleefully describes. His barely concealed joy at the downfall of Garvey and the UNIA reveals a commonality of interest among the imperialist white ruling class, Padmore, and the Communist International on one side, and Garvey, along with the millions of Africans who supported him and the UNIA vision of national liberation on the other side. 3 years after the publication of this book, Padmore left the Communist International, perhaps after discovering it was the headquarters of reformers and social fascists for whom he wanted to protect the white workers. He would eventually end up a Pan-Africanist in the company of W.E.B. Du Bois, whom he had characterized in this same book as a petty bourgeois reformist. He was now a virulent anti-communist, and author of the book Pan-Africanism or Communism, for which he is probably best known and revered by petty bourgeois Pan-Africanists. As we stated in African Internationalism versus Pan-Africanism quoted above, and we quote here, people ask, can there be revolutionary Pan-Africanism? I think that's an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. Pan-Africanism does not have the ability to recognize the class question. Therefore, whoever wants to be a Pan-Africanist can be. Nkrumah was a communist, but I've been in London with people who call themselves Pan-Africanists who are anti-communist. A Pan-Africanist is whatever somebody who calls himself a Pan-Africanist wants to be, unquote. Pan-Africanism liquidates the class contradiction that's killing us all over the world. To win the total liberation and unification of Africa and consolidate our nation, we have to be absolutely clear. African internationalism informs us that the African working class aligned with poor peasants must unequivocally lead this struggle for African liberation. Every other class force wavers in its loyalty to imperialist white power that affords them the promise of material or other benefits at the expense of the suffering African working class and the subjugated African nation. I was looking online just yesterday at a struggle that a lot of African petty bourgeois forces or wannabe petty bourgeois forces are having with our party in occupied Azania that's commonly called South Africa. And it is an interesting struggle because those forces want to justify the existence of capitalism and want to say that in order for us to be free, that we have to become billionaires and capitalism is the way forward. And that is, to us, African nationalism, such an obvious contradiction that it sometimes seems silly. But there are Africans who actually believe this and who would liquidate, obscure, or ignore the fact that capitalism came into existence through enslaving Africa and Africans. And that includes Africans who currently in our national homeland and Africa itself. And it sounds extraordinary to hear Africans on the continent who are arguing about why we need capitalism when it is capitalism that has done everything possible to destroy our Africa and created the conditions on the continent that has impoverished the entire continent of Africa. The entire continent of Africa living on the worst kind of poverty as a consequence of what capitalism did to us in the process of coming into existence. The success of the Garvey movement in this program is the best concrete evidence of the sense of sameness experienced by Africans worldwide. The UNIA was an organization of several million members and supporters throughout the world, including Australia. Its influence continues to be experienced by Africans even today, a century after its founding. The Garvey movement's 1920 Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World, held in Manhattan at Madison Square Garden, attracted between 25,000 and 50,000 people from throughout the African world. This was an amazing accomplishment at a time when communications and transportation were considerably more difficult than they are today, and our national oppression placed formidable constraints on our mobility, both within the U.S. and in the colonial territories in Africa and elsewhere. The historic Garvey movement convention was the only place in the world that afforded Africans a democratic opportunity to vote their political preferences. Marcus Garvey was elected the provisional president of Africa by convention attendees, and the red, black, and green flag was adopted as the national colors for African people. It was also at this convention that the delegates enthusiastically adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World as their program, giving political definition to the collective national interests of the struggle of Africans worldwide. The 1920 Garvey Movement Convention addressed the common issues of oppression and resistance. It cemented a united world African consciousness and an expression of power that sent the Communist Party scurrying to the U.S. government to collaborate in the attack that would imprison and deport Garvey and destroy the Garvey movement. The crushing of the Garvey movement took the combined endeavors of the U.S. and other imperialist governments of the time, along with a motley assortment of enemies of various hues and ideological leanings who were all opposed to the notion of our national liberation as Africans. With the destruction of the Garvey movement, with the dreams of African people who aspired to consolidate our African nation, an aspiration left to our party to accomplish. The African nation is real. It is distinguished by a number of elements, both objective and subjective. Clearly, there is a sense of sameness, something that Europeans and Negro scholars often pretend does not exist, but which nevertheless exposes itself to public view every time Africans come to harm from or achieve a victory over imperialist white power. There is a sense of sameness. black people around the world. To talk about nation and nationality, among them exists a subjective factor and a sense of sameness. That is to say, black people, even though we speak different languages and sometimes act crazy when we are together, experiencing each other in some ways, we experience a sense of sameness too, so that when we see African people in trouble, any place in the world, we don't have to be there. We don't have to know the language they speak. And sometimes we know they speak different language. When we see African people in trouble, there's a sense of sameness that we experience. When we go on trips and travel any place, we always look to see if there are other Africans there that we can hook up with. There is a sense of sameness. We have the same dances, whether we are in Congo or whether we are in North St. Louis. We dance the same. We dress the same, generally speaking, all around the world. I was talking to a comrade just 2 days ago or so that you can go to any urban place where African lives on the planet Earth, and you will see that Africans dress alike. You will see groups of Africans, some with dashikis and some with whatever the hell else that we have designed for Europeans in some place around the world. There is a sense of sameness there. We experience that sense of sameness. And I remember a sister, I met her, I think in Alabama, but she was from Kenya. And she talks about how, the Maasai, an ethnic group in Kenya, they often described as, tall and noble, like, you see the picture of them standing almost like what people would characterize as a yoga pose, standing with the spear, etc. And she says to me that in Kenya, she says to me that Africans who are from Kenya and they watch Africans in this country, she says, and that they refer to as soul brothers. It said, soul brothers walk like the Messiah, and there is a thing about us that's recognizable and a sense of sameness. Few quibble that black people in Africa itself are some variation of African, although sub-identities or ethnicity or tribe and or religion often challenge the significance of the fact that they are African. The colonial dividing borders imposed on Africa by Europeans are part of the parasitic process of achieving European national identity through destroying the African collective identity and facilitating the colonial theft of African resources. One function of the borders has been to prevent the consolidation of a single continental-wide national economy that would be the primary material foundation of national unification, including one African language. The commonality of African, that is to say, a national economy, we said, would be the primary material foundation of national unification, including one African language. And people often comment of the variety of languages that we speak on the continent of Africa. And so how do we get around the language question? How, we're going to learn how to communicate with each other. That's another story. I mean, we can speak Chinese, but we can't speak Yoruba and various other languages that are now used to divide us. But the fact is that language, the function of language, people learn to speak in order to participate in production. That's why you had to speak, in order to produce. Humans distinguished ourselves by having to learn to talk to each other just in order to produce, because we produce collectively. And the common economy, national economy that links the entire Africa into a single national economy would serve the purpose also of liquidating or creating a national language. That is to say, as opposed to an ethnic language or a national language, a language that connects us all. We would have to, in order to be able to produce. But because of these different entities that they've created for us, they lock us into this place where even today you not only have a so-called language in a particular country, and that's That's false, because the languages that we speak in Africa cross these artificial borders, because the languages themselves for different ethnic groups and so-called tribes also function because to facilitate production in that small unit that they call a tribe, family, clan, tribe. This is how the organization of production revolved around that. And the greater the productive organization of production that is united, then the greater the unity in every other way of the African population. So the language that we speak now is a consequence of freezing us in place, more or less, with these artificial borders. And I want to say, I'm tempted to say freezing the productive process. In some ways, that's true, but in the greatest way, what has happened to us is that production no longer, we don't participate in production for ourselves except for minimally. And that's probably the only thing that keeps us alive upon reflection. For the most part, production is for the capitalist, imperialist forces outside of Africa. Or in Africa, if you're in a place like South Africa or you know, and Kenya, various other places where you still have the bloodsuckers, you know, right there with us. The commonality of African culture and language would consolidate, develop, and flourish under the influence of African self-serving economic forces unleashed from the distorted, limiting imposition of borders that divert all things of value to the service of external forces. Historically, our resources and labor have benefited Europe and Europeans primarily. But today, this increasingly involves China, India, Turkey, and every imperialist aspiring predator capable of entering the feeding frenzy on African soil. In the U.S., it is generally agreed that there is a debate about China for some people who call themselves progressive, whether China is an imperialist force, etc., and standing in the United States and not assuming an African national identity, perhaps that is debatable. But as an African, quite conscious of the responsibility of Africa and African people to control the productive process in Africa, and of Africans, then it's clear to us that China is an intrusive force that, while different, and some may argue less exploitative, it functions in its own interest, separate from the interests of Africa. And if Africa benefits at all from Chinese economic influence there, it is only coincidental. And this is not this is more a statement about the condition in Africa than it is about Chinese intentions. Although China will have its own intentions based primarily on its relationship with the rest of the world. That's primarily what it's based on. And coming into Africa, the Chinese great economic and political thrust into Africa is based primarily on the relationship that China has to the rest of the world. It is in contention with the U.S. It is in contention with Europe, etc. It does not see Africa as a contender. It sees Africa as a part of the loop that gives rise to economic progress for those who can most successfully penetrate into Africa. And China, I believe, has an interest in lifting up the conditions of existence of Chinese people. And in China, in Singapore, and in the community right here in North St. Louis, where I see chop suey joints all over the place. In the U.S., it is generally agreed that Africans constitute a distinct community with a distinct history and culture. No scholarly studies are needed to make this point. There is disagreement, of course, on the question of whether these distinct features contribute to the definition of Africans as a distinct nation. Some of the problems surrounding this question in North America revolve around two issues. One is the fact that Europeans themselves are new to the continent, having wrenched it from the custody of the indigenous people through brutish, horrendous, genocidal oppression that contributed to the culture of violence that defines the European nation. To admit that Africans constitute a nation is to thrust to the surface an underlying question that the white nation cannot tolerate, namely, if they are Africans, then who are we? Secondly, there is the question of the size and viability of the African population inside the U.S. Some people say, well, you can't be a nation because there are so few of you. Of course, there are more African people in North America than white people in some European countries that pose as nations. Nevertheless, Africans are held to a different standard on this issue. This takes us back to Garvey and the UNIA. This takes us back to the African People's Socialist Party and the African Socialist International. This takes us to the recognition that the African nation is not confined to the borders imposed on us by Europe, whether in Africa or the various places to which we have been forcibly dispersed. Let's say this again. This takes us to the recognition that the African nation is not confined to the borders imposed on us by Europe, whether in Africa or the various places to which we have been forcibly dispersed. As African internationalists, we recognize that the basis of our struggle is the European attack on Africa, the forced dispersal and colonization of untold millions of its inhabitants, and the creation of artificial borders used to facilitate the alienation of Africans from each other, from our resources, and from our national identity. Our position here does not ignore the fact that false national consciousness has been imposed on Africans worldwide through the violence of the imperialist state and imperialist imposed ignorance. In West Africa, there's a territory known as Cameroon, named for the Portuguese word for shrimp, after the Portuguese colonizers discovered an abundance of shrimp in its waters. The fact that there are thousands of Africans that refer to themselves as shrimp does not make them shrimp any more than an African in England is a black Brit, or an African in the U.S. a Negro or African American. Africans throughout the world continue to exist under some form of colonial domination. In this era, that takes the form of indirect or neo-colonial rule by the European imperialist state in disguise. Africans throughout the world continue to exist under some form of colonial domination. In this era, that takes the form of indirect or neo-colonial rule by the European imperialist state in disguise. The capitalist imperialist state, unlike its feudal predecessor, was born as an international state through imperialist colonial slavery, the foundation of capitalism and the European nation. The capitalist imperialist state, unlike its feudal predecessor, was born as an international state through imperialist colonial slavery, the foundation of capitalism and the European nation. I hope folk are with me on this question, because we're looking at the issue of the state, what the state is, how the state comes into existence, and the role that it plays in human society. And we're talking about a state that came into existence. And we recognize that capitalism is a world social system. It is not a local, a domestic entity. Capitalism is a world system. It defines the economic relationship of everybody on the planet Earth at this point. And it came into existence as a world system, an international system. And the capitalism itself did. Therefore, the capitalist state also came into existence as an international state. It began to express itself during this process of enslaving people, of ripping off land and resources from other peoples around the world, that it transported where? Back to Europe. This is how the capitalist state defined itself. And what is recognized as a state in most instances, however, are those institutions of oppression and coercion that exist within what is characterized as the national territories throughout Europe. But the state is international, the capitalist state. The feudal state was not an international state. The capitalist state came into existence through slavery and colonialism. The bourgeois state manifests itself in Europe as relatively benign in relations to white people. Nigeria, Sudan, and all of Africa, as well as in Ireland, India, the Middle East, Asia, and all of the colonized territories of this planet, including inside the U.S., the North American, European imperialist state, has been highly armed and unremittingly violent. Hence, the British state that was vicious in its colonies bragged about police not carrying guns in England. That is, until their colonial subjects immigrated to England in enough numbers to create domestic colonies like the ones found in the U.S. since its bloody advent through genocide and colonial slavery. You hear this discussion all the time. One way or another, the British used to brag about how civilized they were as compared to the Americans, because in Britain, the cops didn't even have to carry guns, while in the U.S., everybody has a gun. And the reason everybody has a gun is why? Because they had citizens that were extensions of the state, and the state founded in the United States was precisely for killing indigenous people, holding the land of the Mexicans, and keeping Africans on slave colonies, etc. So everybody has a gun. Violence is something that was always perpetrated inside the United States by the bourgeois state. Whereas in England, most of the violence, with the maturation of capitalism anyway, most of the violence that the British state utilized was against the people in Ireland, against Africans in places like Nigeria and other English-speaking colonies around the world. And that's how it was true with some of the other European states. So while they talk about the British Bobbies not carrying guns, they did carry guns. They just didn't carry them in England. They were armed to the teeth in Nigeria. They were armed to the teeth in Ireland. They were armed to the teeth where the colonies existed, because that is where the fundamental class contradiction in the world exists, in the colonial question. Y'all with me on that? And so what has happened in England is that more and more of the colonized have immigrated to England. So they don't talk about the Bobbies don't have no guns no more, because they do have guns. And that they have to control Africans who were once in Brixton and various other sectors where there are concentration of African and colonized people. And certainly the French have to carry them everywhere, because what the French colonialism in Africa and around the world is now having consequences in France that they never anticipated before. And anyway. The United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a host of international institutions along with the U.S. Army Command, with the U.S. Africa Command, and the various U.S. and European military function as arms of a combined European capitalist state with the purpose of violently barring us from seizing control of our African nation. There's also the case for the neo-colonial African governments that, for the most part, clearly rely on charity handouts from imperialist states or instructors for funding, training, and leadership. Nevertheless, we can say without hesitation that the African nation does exist. We are one nation in need of consolidation, a nation definable by objective and subjective characteristics, with features arising specifically in response to historical necessity, just like the European nation. While the subjective material foundation of the African nation is fundamental, this does not limit or undermine the subjective element, the sense of sameness experienced by Africans everywhere. The most important defining material or objective element of the African nation is its derivation from Africa, the national homeland of African people. This is the critical component of African identity from which most of the subjective factors derive. The African nation is also defined in part by physiognomy. We are black people of and from Africa, the equatorial continent. Physiognomy, how we look. Right? Your booty. So to speak. This common connection to Africa carries with it deep and profound cultural connections going back thousands of years, as previously shown in the quote by Cheikh Anta Diop. In 1962, Joseph Key Zerbo made similar assertions about the African nation, included in a 1975 anthology entitled Readings in African Political Thought. Kizerbo discusses in African personality and the new African society, quote, contrary to the colonial image which presents pre-colonial Africa as a collection of tiny groups torn by internal strife and tribal warfare, sociologically frozen at the stage of protozoan or an amoeba, African society was highly organized. Its principal features, in my opinion, were the following. First, the authority of the old people. In Africa, the hierarchy of power, of consideration, and of prestige was in direct rapport with the hierarchy of age. The Council of Elders in traditional Africa was the supreme political master of the city or the tribe. It was often this autocracy of the old that evolved into a veritable cult of ancestor worship. Another important characteristic of the traditional society is solidarity, and this point is too obvious to require any lengthy examination. I would, however, like to say that this solidarity is not just a phenomenon of the superstructure, right? It's not just a phenomenon of the superstructure, right? A trembling of the spirit or a tenderness of heart toward others. This solidarity is imprinted in the very basic structure of African culture, and especially in its economic organization. You know that in the traditional African society, the notion of property was defined in terms of the family, community, or the village, and not in terms of the individual. The concept of personal property in terms of the individual is generally alien to African social concepts. Fields are common property, and work is most often collective. Another fields, you know, that people farm and work or have their cattle and whatever, they are common property, and the work is most often collective. Another social manifestation of the solidarity is hospitality, which it is true is obviously not an African monopoly, but which nevertheless is particularly strong there. And here I'm pleased to associate North Africa with the rest of the continent. Another important feature is the equalitarian character of African society. Naturally, I do not intend in any way to idealize or present traditional Africa as the best of all possible or imaginary worlds. Africa has had its tyrants, as have other nations throughout history, but it must be stressed also that the traditional African society often included classes based solely on functional differentiation. Classes based solely on functional differentiation. There was, for instance, a mason class, the blacksmith class, the warrior class, but the fact that in Africa property was common, the fact that there was no class that accumulated the capital property and reduced others to the state of mere tenancy, mere peasants or farmers whose toil was used to amass profit, well, that fact proves that the exploitation of man by man never achieved the status of a system in the traditional society of Africa. And moreover, by reason of the unlimited solidarity of which I have just spoken, the true principle of such a society was to each according to his needs, to the extent of the complete utilization of common revenues, unquote. We can see our commonality in Africa, but as we pointed out earlier, no nation is defined solely in relationship to itself. To say that a nation is one thing is to say that it's not another. Dark skin is a product of equatorial Africa, the land of black people. Black people among ourselves will be incapable of defining ourselves as such, right? If the only people were black, then there would be no black, right? And the reason you can say you're black is because you're speaking of that in relationship to something else. It is through our relationship with so-called white people and the dialectic of the oppressor nation and the oppressed nation that Africans became black. We can say, therefore, that the African nation is one born of its historical ties to its African national homeland with a core sense of sameness that includes a common culture, history, and physiognomy. Still, to arrive at a full definition of the African nation, we must say more than this. The African nation is informed by historical necessity, determined by our conditions of existence at this very moment, hundreds of years subsequent to our defining conflict with the European predator nation. Africa's parasitic attachment to Africa, Europe's parasitic attachment to Africa and Africans shapes and determines both its successful existence and our national incoherence. So the success of Europe and our lack of success is defined by the parasitic connection that we have with Europe. A critical feature of our conditions of existence as a people is the imperialist, near total control of the economic life of Africa and African people wherever we are located in the world. Neither Africa the land nor Africans the people, both fundamental components of the productive forces, have been accessible to Africa for the production and reproduction of real life for Africa and Africans. Neither the land or the people have been accessible to Africa and to African people ourselves. Hence, Africa has created staggering wealth for imperialism that has benefited the entire European nation, ruling class, middle class, workers, and others at our expense. Everything they have stolen from our labor, resources, and knowledge, everything they have was stolen from our labor, resources, and knowledge, everything. We have a historical mandate to take back what is ours and fulfill our destiny as a united, independent, self-governing nation in control of our own continent and future. This is an immensely profound reality that must be internalized by Africans and all peoples throughout the globe who have an interest in destroying forever this blood-sucking culture of violence stemming from U.S. European imperialism. Therefore, historical necessity, the absolute requirement of any people to produce and reproduce life as a condition of existence, survival, and a meaningful future requires the consolidation of the African nation. Therefore, historical necessity, the absolute requirement of any people to produce and reproduce life as a condition of existence, survival, and meaningful future requires the consolidation of the African nation. The consolidation of the African nation is a prerequisite for overturning the abject genocidal conditions of existence of Africans everywhere. There is no separate solution for the liberation of African people based on colonially defined borders or identity any place on earth. Clearly, the African liberation movement has run into its limitations when fought within the context of these borders. Civil rights and flag independence only serve to obscure our oppressive exploitation, not overturn it. Millions of Africans have been forcibly dispersed from Africa throughout the world. Europeans and others have come to Africa, some as colonizers, some as subjects of colonial powers who were allowed privilege in Africa as intermediary colonial agents functioning as buffers between Africans and our oppressors, a situation contributing to absolute African dependency and the atrophy of African productive forces. Other occupants of Africa are descendants of the Arab conquest in Africa preceding that of Europe. How do these various forces fit into our definition of the African nation? First of all black people forcibly transported to diverse parts of the world as part of the process giving rise to capitalism and the European nation are Africans, period. Secondly, all black people throughout the world are potentially part of the African nation, whether they were part of the forcible dispersal or whether their presence in other places predates the assault on Africa. This includes black people in Australia, India, and other places who generally experience a sense of sameness associated with African blackness and the oppression we share because of our blackness. Under imperialist world domination, blackness is universally perceived as justification for our oppression. For those Africans forcibly dispersed from Africans, we are directly connected to each other by the parasitic capitalist world economy under whose weight we continue to groan in poverty and oppression as the economic foundation of the European nation. All our cultural expressions found everywhere. All our cultural expressions found everywhere we are dispersed. Music, dance, and other art forms and traditions have their foundation in Africa. On the continent of Africa, our national home, let's just say, reggae is just as much a part of African culture as Ray Charles and James Brown and Fela and the various other places. They have the same source, Afro-Cuban music, etc. On the continent of Africa, our national homeland, there are many Europeans who came as colonizers. They have chosen to remain in Africa after nominal independence was declared in some territories, including Zimbabwe, Namibia, Kenya, and South Africa as prime examples. In South Africa, white people called themselves Africans prior to independence. In fact, they appropriated the name Africa for themselves. They became the Afrikaners, and we were Kafirs and other kinds of names that they gave to us. Are these white people genuinely a part of the African nation by just declaring themselves so? The fact is that all Europeans, including those in Africa, are beneficiaries of the imperialist economy derived from African colonialism and slavery. This means they live at the expense of Africans. This places them concretely and objectively in the category of the European nation, even as they may now be forced to disguise their European national identity for the purpose of maintaining a parasitic attachment to Africa. In Namibia, for example, you will find that the white people have both Namibian and British passports. This attachment of European colonizers to Africa objectively undermines the consolidation of the African nation, whose blackness is an identifying badge of exploitation and oppression. This does not mean that whites from the colonizing nation cannot become a part of the African nation. What it does mean is that whites would have to commit national suicide, abandoning the interests of the European parasitic oppressor nation and uniting with the historical trajectory of the African nation to achieve black power. Whites in Africa must unite with the capture of total economic and political power by African workers in a borderless continent. Power in the hands of African workers is the only way to unleash the productive forces of Africa, allowing Africa and Africans to engage in the process of producing life for Africa and Africans the world over. Objectively, this would mean white people in Africa would have to voluntarily relinquish to the African nation the vast resources they have accumulated through their past identification with the parasitic European nation. In the final analysis, the struggle against world capitalism, resting as it does on the exploitation of the majority of the peoples of the world, will require the destruction of the white or European nation that requires for its existence a parasitic relationship to the majority of humanity. The national liberation of Africa and African people will be a leading force in that destruction. The role of genuine white or European communists will be to actively engage in the commission of national suicide by becoming one with the national liberation of Africans and others. This is a far cry from the current position of most self-declared white communists who talk instead about the need of the oppressed of the world to unite with their narcissistically defined European version of history. A similar situation is that of the Arabs who came into Africa as conquerors, initiating the enslavement of African people that lasted 1,500 years and paved the way for the European transatlantic slave trade. Similar to Europeans, Arabs must embrace the historically necessary trajectory of Africa toward black power as their own. We saw the potential for this kind of unity in the 1960s when Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt stood as one of the strongest allies of Kwame Nkrumah in his attempt to create a united Africa. Ahmed Ben Bella, revolutionary fighter and first president of liberated Algeria, was another who cast his lot with the African nation. Both men shared with Africa a sense of sameness that showed promise for consolidating all of North Africa into the African nation. In addition to the practical examples of Nasser and Ben Bella, there is the example of Black Haiti, which upon achieving independence from France in 1804, created a constitution declaring citizenship and land ownership for blacks only, but which defined whites, including the Poles who fought with Africans in the struggle for independence, as black for the purpose of citizenship. This was a historic case of whites committing national suicide and consciously abandoning the pedestal upon which the European nation rests as a parasite on Africa and the world. This is a case of Europeans accepting their own, as their own, the struggle for the achievement of revolutionary black power. We also mentioned, and let me just say, when we talk about what happened in Haiti as an example, it's a splendid example. For those who want to talk about how it can't happen, it's a splendid example. But also we have to remember that we're talking about a subjective factor, and then there's an objective factor. And the objective factor that binds it all is the economic thing. So even if Haiti, for a minute, appears to be free and has achieved some form of liberation, objectively, Europe and America, and especially America, continue to control the economy. So the foundation upon which this sense of nationhood and nationality existed in Haiti was subject to the same pulls and stresses that the rest of the world is. And what I found is that it's easier to be black when things are going your way. And I mean, you know, the same tensions pulled Michael Jackson into, you know, self-mutilation and what have you in the other directions. So the economic factor is a critical objective factor that we have to remember. We also mentioned the presence of in Africa, people from India and other former colonies who were brought to the continent by the British for the express purpose of acting as a colonial buffer between the imperialists and the often resisting African masses. There are literally millions of Indians in Africa today, most of whom live at a much higher standard of living than both the majority of Africans and the majority of people in India. This shows how the pedestal upon which Europeans sit on our backs can be and has been opened up to petty bourgeois sectors of formerly colonized countries and who now enjoy the benefits of white power at our expense. Thus, Arabs, Europeans, and residents of Africa from European colonies can become Africans if they commit national suicide and abandon their parasitic relationship to African people. That's it. You can't be no parasite and be one of us at the same time. And this is not racial politic here. This is based on objective reality. If you're part of a parasitic colony that's a colonial economy that sucks the blood of Africa, then it's ridiculous to now say that I'm an African too. It's crazy. You know, you have to abandon that material thing that keeps Africa subject to exploitation, oppression in order to make it into the club. They must financially, politically, and in every other way unite with the leadership of and become one with the African working class and the aims of a united and liberated Africa. The African nation, then, is a community of people whose core identity is based on historical ties to the equatorial continent of Black Africa, contributing to a common culture, history, and physiognomy. The African nation is also comprised of all those African people who have been forcibly dispersed to various places in the world through colonial slavery. Dispersed Africans were part of the process of the development of capitalism in the European nation, a process that requires our subjugation and national incoherence. It requires our national incoherence. See, you can't be subjective. You cannot be subjugated in some other land as long as you remember who the hell you are and where you came from. Because if you remember who you are and where you came from, then the struggle that you're involved in remains alive. You understand? You ain't just fighting to get off Mr. Bubba's plantation. The struggle remains alive. The historical mission remains alive. And that's really important for us to understand. Additionally, the African nation is comprised of many who experience a sense of sameness, a subjective connection to Africa, mainly because of skin color that helps to define their imperialist-inspired, impoverished, and oppressed state of existence. The Dalit in India, the indigenous Australia and other areas where the African presence goes back to earliest times, such as in the Asia-Pacific region, are included in this category. Finally, the African nation can include people of other nationalities living in Africa who commit nationalist suicide, becoming part of the African working class and abandoning all allegiance to a predatory colonial relationship to African people. The truth, stated simply, is we are Africans, whatever else we may be called, because we say we are Africans and we feel like we are Africans. Africa is the national homeland of all black people worldwide. It is the land to which the identity of the African nation is firmly and irreversibly affixed. Our historical connection to Africa represents the critical element in the material basis for African nationality. For although we have been forcibly dispersed by colonial slavery and related factors subsequent to the initial European attack on Africa, our current conditions of existence, both in Africa and abroad, are essentially defined by the consequences of our forced dispersal. Here we remind ourselves that it was Europe that divided Africa with the illegitimate borders that now still function to facilitate the theft of Africa's still vast resources by various imperialist forces. The colonial division of Africa continues to separate Africans from each other and from our resources that are being expropriated without cessation. The 54 delineated territories currently characterized as African nations were created in a conference held in Berlin, Germany in 1884-85, attended by contending European states that parcel Africa out among themselves, resulting in the map that is known as Africa today. The result of this European invention has been the evolvement of a false national consciousness that fits the interests of the imperialists who created it at the expense of Africans ourselves. There were no pre-colonial borders separating Africans from each other. Now, borders surround 54 colonially created entities, many of which cut right down the middle of ancient family or kinship territories, dividing and pitting against each other Africans that lived together for time immemorial. Clearly, this physical and psychological separation has facilitated false national consciousness, not to mention a myriad of other traumas. The practical significance of this clarification concerning the African nation and its relationship to the European imperialist nation was discussed in our book, One People, One Party, One Destiny. I should quote it. The anti-imperialist struggles of the world's peoples for repossession of our sovereignty and resources, both human and material, are the basis of the current deep crisis of imperialism. They are struggles to remove the pedestal upon which the entire rotten edifice of imperialism rests. They are struggles that enlist the vast majority of humanity, the laboring masses of every nation, in the creation of a new world without exploitation and oppression, without slaves and slave masters, and ultimately without borders. We recognize that the struggle for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people, the struggle for the consolidation of the African nation, is ultimately a struggle that undermines the solidarity of the European nation state. We understand that under imperialism, those who were enslaved, colonized, and oppressed as a people will have to win liberation as a people. We are also clear that the successful nation-building struggles of Africans and others under the leadership of the working class is at the same time the beginning of the process of the withering away of nations. The European nation was born as a bourgeois nation at the expense of whole peoples and their territories. As we have seen in this discussion, it is a nation that requires the oppression and exploitation of whole peoples for its successful existence. Hence, African people have to resist the imperialist bourgeoisie as a people. Our assumption of consolidated nationhood will function to destroy the bourgeois nation. Thus, the rise of revolutionary worker nation states destroy the material basis for the existence of nations and borders that function to distinguish and separate one people from another. This is easier to understand when we finally realize the significance of the fact that capitalism at birth came wrapped in the skin of the racialized European nation state. It is this reality that made impotent the Marxist assumption of communism resulting from the withering away of the European bourgeois industrial state. However, the fact that the European bourgeois nation state achieves life and definition from its relationship to Africa and the oppressed peoples of the world means that our victory over imperialism, with the African working class at the helm, will result in the withering away of nations. This will leave bare and make possible the withering away of the bourgeois state, which will have become historically redundant, unquote. Consolidating the African nation and building the African People's Socialist Party as the tool to achieve that goal must be at the top of the agenda of every African on earth. Every struggle must lead to this end. Every border must be broken down. The crisis of imperialism must be deepened daily. It is on the shoulders of Africans alive today to complete the struggle that our people have waged for more than 500 years. The liberation of Africa and reunification of African people everywhere. The consolidation of the African nation. Independence, unification, and socialism in our lifetime. All right.
Uhuru. Uhuru. That was a powerful reading from Chairman Omali Yesatela. Give another round of applause. Uhuru. It is now time to open up with questions from the audience and online viewers. And we want to appreciate everyone who is on with us via Facebook and YouTube, and appreciate all your engagements from likes, comments, and shares. And because of time, we want everyone to know that if your questions wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that Chairman sees your questions. We'll go ahead and open it up now for questions, if there's any questions at this time.
Uhuru, Chairman, I just really want to appreciate this whole political report. Week after week, it's just been so dynamite. But the question of the nationhood is very, very significant and important. And I know for me, to really understand that I'm an African was very significant to the development into political life. And so I just really appreciate that, and just, how you drive it home and really help us to understand the question of the nation. When you were talking, it made me think of, and I could be wrong, so that's what I'm asking, it made me think of an old movie that they like to show every February, the so-called Black History Month, with the African that constantly wanted to connect this, say his name, and they kept trying to beat it out of him. Roots, and it was like he kept connecting. He knew it was a fight inside of him. Long as he connected himself to, you know, to Africa, he wanted to continue to tell the stories of Africa and say his name. And he didn't care what they did to breathe them out of him. I don't know if I really grasped that. You know, we would tell, you know, jokes when we were little about, like making fun of that. But when you were talking about this, I thought about that, you know, of how you say that, you know, long as we know who we are, you know, the fight is still alive. So I just really appreciate this political education, because the question of, the whole, I've said in, crazy meetings where people would talk about, I came here when I was little and my mom is from Africa and my dad was born here and I'm a Nigerian American, crazy things like that. And nobody could, really, have a worldview to be able to define what they even mean. And so this question is so important, and I appreciate the party for taking this on in a real profound way and connecting us to our birthright, and it's not in some, states in the South. Uhuru.
That's one of the really important things that we're dealing with. The Haley's plagiarized book that he was influenced to do after this long interviews with Malcolm X. He was the author of the autobiography of Malcolm X, if you will, was influenced by real life events. Horrible things were done to Africans. We were branded, so we would be known as numbers instead of as people with names and things like that. And to take away your name is a fundamental way of dehumanizing one. It's akin to becoming Lassie or Rin Tin Tin or some other animal that's owned, a product that's owned by someone else. It's a fundamental aspect of dehumanization. And this is, if we look back to when I began reading earlier on and talked about how George Padmore was able to simply remove African and put Negro there, because the Negro is something that was created by Europe and white people and white power. It's not a nation. It's not a nation. So you can say that all the Negroes of the world share common conditions and et cetera. And the process of doing that, liquidate the national question, liquidate that we are a nation of people. And it was, so if you look at it now, it's such a silly thing, it's obvious, certainly to African internationalists, but it seemed to be meaningful to white people and to their employees like Padmore to characterize us in that fashion. So to be a Negro is not to be an African, right? And that's part of the whole thing, is to liquidating our identity, even to make one a South African, as we have right now, to lock our identity in this false created borders and becoming a South African, So that is right. Haley's book was born on actual things that were done to us. This was actually true. To beat us, to do everything so that we would be given white names. Sometimes when we go into restaurants occasionally now, and there are Africans in the restaurant and say, or we meet Africans who come to our meeting and say, what's your name? And say, Robert, And I say, well, how the hell what do they call you at home? And say, well, it's easier to say Robert than what my name is, And I don't know if that can possibly be considered easier than Brzezinski, or a lot of other names that we end up learning. But when you say it's easier, it means that you pay a price when you use what your name is. And I remember periods of time where editorials written by Africans against African women and children, African women who in the U.S. who would name their children, create names. They just reject the Judy and Mary Jane and stuff like that and create our own names. And what that's going to mean in terms of you being able to get a job now that you have that name. This is the punishment. This is the beating that Kunta Kinte received for refusing to be Toby Uhuru. Where your mask, come man? No, your mask.
Yeah, it was said to do that during the announcements.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted, there's a few questions or comments online that address it. That one was LaFour from Virgin Islands. This was a comment. And
Spell that name.
LAHFU. From LaFour from Virgin Islands. And this is a question. He said, I would like to know, the Congress of Chairman's position on what is going on in Uganda with Museveni.
Museveni. They call him Museveni, but it's Museveni. He got his name because I think it might have been his father or his grandfather worked for the 7th Army, some kind of military force for England. And Museveni means like Maafrika. Maafrika means African, of Africa, and Museveni means of 7. So his name, the name ended up being Museveni. But go ahead. And of course we could talk about Uganda. When you say, what is the rest of the question?
That was it.
So what is position on what?
He said,
what's happening in Uganda?
What's going on in Uganda with Museveni?
Well, all kinds of nasty stuff is going on in Uganda. I do want us to continue this discussion on the nation, though, because there's much to be said about what's happening in Uganda. Museveni, who's the darling of Pan-Africanists every place, all around, is a brute. He's been kept in power. He's has been a darling of U.S. imperialism and other Western imperialist countries, along with people like Paul Kagame, who played a really important role in the war that Kagame was trained by U.S. military forces, lived in Uganda for a long period of time, and represented this whole U.S. drive that, first of all, overturned the power in, not Burundi, I'm sorry. Come on, you know where I'm talking about. Kagame, they're occupying Eastern Congo. They fight with, they work with Museveni in the war in Eastern Congo, and with the Hutu and the Tutsi, Rwanda. Yeah, so they played a role, and even now they participate in looting Congo. Kagame, Museveni, all play that role. But he's a tyrant. He's a murderous brute, and is repressing the people in a very serious way who are trying to overturn his ability to stay in office, to stay in power there. And there's a lot that could be said, but I'm hoping that we can talk about the nation. In some ways, it relates to the national question because it all, deals with this whole false national borders that have been created. And there's this Lord Resistance Army in northern, particularly northern Uganda, that came about first as an opposition to Museveni, and then has degenerated, as these forces often will degenerate if you don't have a coherent and scientific philosophy that guides your struggle, they often degenerate and you become the very same force that you're fighting against. You use the same tact, the same methods, and so the Lord Resistance Army. And you've heard some things about them. That's where the U.S. is offering their existence as an explanation or justification for extensive U.S. intervention in that area of Africa. So I don't know, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about Museveni. He, as I said, he's the darling, or has been the darling of many of the Pan-Africanists for a long period of time.
This before the question from the audience, this is a comment from Kamanti from Kansas City. And he commented saying Swahili may be the most viable national language in Africa to facilitate an organization of production, and has anywhere from 50 to 100 million speakers, marking it the largest language on the continent. And then Christopher Klein from Springfield, Missouri, say, glad that you're touching on the misconceptions of Marcus Garvey. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Swahili is a widely spoken language that is sometimes attacked by some African, some nationalists, because they like to call it an Arab language. But Swahili is a trade language in the same way Lingala is a trade language. And Lingala is widely spoken in areas of Congo anyway. And but the truth of the matter is Swahili is a good example only because it reflects how trade and commerce contributes to a consolidation of language, giving it a greater universal character. And I think we will see an Africa unbound, having just the extraordinary creative and consolidation of language. I think that's going to be really powerful, and it's going to contain elements of not only different African different languages with their origin on the continent of Africa itself, but of African people who are located in other parts around the world who speak some variation of colonial languages. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru.
I just really want to appreciate this entire study and this entire process that you put out in our last study is the process of creating the African working class intellectuals and binding us to a theory that unites us with our material interest, and which is African internationalism, a free and liberated Africa. And it's just a beautiful and amazing process altogether, and just really unite with the call for the nation to unite. And it's just really amazing the way you lay everything out and the way you put everything together, and that it's not something that continuously we learn that we're unable to learn, or we're unable to put such theories like this together. And it's because you have done this, we can do it, and because you've laid it out, we can participate and free ourselves as African people and have power in our hands in our lifetime. So just really want to appreciate you, Chairman, for that, and salute you for that. And I have 2 questions, per usual. And my 2 questions are, the first one is how you laid out that, could you deepen when you said that the whole thing around the super profit hides the opportunism of the white worker? And then the next question is, what was it? Oh, it was a good one too. Hold on. How African people, we produce for ourselves minimally, and how that's probably the only reason why we are living today.
Yes. Let me go back to, let me start with the last thing that you raised first in terms of the minimal production that African people do for ourselves. The truth is, if we did not have our own little plots of land, or if we didn't have the cars out of the trunks for which we sell stuff in our own communities and engage in that level of production, there wouldn't be any production. That's what makes us so vulnerable for things like the introduction of a drug economy in the community, because there is no other economic life. Generally speaking, a very little economic life. So Africans have to create ways in order to make a living that outside of what the productive process that has been created to extract value for us, then we find ourselves trying to live. That's the wolf, right? Trying to live, and somebody has created this false alternative, so you're licking the blade, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what happens to us. If it were not for that, and like we used to say, truthfully, if there was no dope money in the community, there wouldn't have been any money in the community. There was a time where this was absolutely true. You know, that the dope man paid the rent, the dope man paid the phone bill, the dope man was the one who got money for the school children, et cetera. And in this instance, I mean, the drug economy that was imposed on our community became that factor. So it's natural for humans. We have to create means by which we feed, clothe, and shelter ourselves. That's the natural thing. So the economy doesn't look exactly like you want it to look. It looks the way it has to look based on what you have to work with. Under any circumstances, if you live in a place of, where the, it's constantly arid and, and little water, you live and survive and create means to survive one way. If you live in places like in the Arctic regions, et cetera, you do it another way. I mean, you don't have absolute freedom to control how you're going to produce and reproduce life. Sometimes other things impose themselves on our reality. And so all over Africa, you will find children. When you're there, you will find children who in the streets, walking between cars, selling this, selling that, because the masses have to produce our own way to live. If it were not for that, generally speaking, we couldn't survive. So when they talk about Africans living off $1 a day to something like that, they're talking about a normal economy that has been created that's been created for us. And that takes us to the question of super profits, because the Marxists and communists like to talk about how the bourgeoisie and imperialists, the capitalists, they're wringing super profits out of the colonies. Well, there's nothing super about it. It's always been like that. And this notion that somehow if they're wringing super profits from us, and this, they say, is what keeps the capitalist system afloat, these super profits. But the profits are not super, they are normal. It's the norm. It is the extraction of value beyond even what's necessary for the production of life. That's why you find such a big difference in the life expectation of Africans on the continent of Africa and in St. Louis and white people. This difference is a normal form of exploitation that comes from being colonized. That's why you look at the rest of the world living, like I mentioned, 80% of the people on earth trying to live off $10 or less US dollars. That's 80%. How the hell are you going to call that super if that's 80? What's super is this other tiny part that's ripping, benefiting from us. That's super relationship. That's normal. And so to call it super profit is to overlook this fundamental thing about the whole thing resting upon the exploitation of the colonized peoples of the world. And that allows people to sacrifice the struggle against colonialism for this thing that they're talking about on the pedestal of colonialism that they talk about profit. Do you understand? So that normalizes, theirs is normal, and what happens to us is extraordinary. When the reality is what happens to us is normal, and what they get from the capitalist thing should be considered extraordinary. Yeah, uhuru.
From Kondo, from occupied Azania, and even today, he stated, even today, whites in South Africa don't see, us as Africans, but as Zulu, Swati, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And he said we are Africans. And then there's another question that Jason out of California. Is it necessary for Africans to adapt a native language and religion and social systems before having self-determination?
I think the achievement of self-determination allows us to adopt any damn thing we want to adopt. I think that the way the question is raised too often presupposes that the way toward liberation is cultural, and that's what historically has been referred to as cultural nationalism, that if you get the cultural thing together, then everything else falls into place. And the truth of the matter, it has been the war, the objective material assault on African people. This creates a whole new economic base that gives support for and rise to the superstructure that we call culture. And so we have to achieve a revolutionary culture to take back our Africa and take back our resources, and then that frees us. That's why, we say, sometimes people say, well, there's this politic in our community, a line that says that somehow white people are actually genetic mutations, right? And that's why we have the thing, white people do the things they do and we live the way we live. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I'm not a geneticist, but I checked the Vietnamese thing out, and they were able to whip their butts. And I checked other people out, and they were able to be successful in the struggle against white people. And I think that, and white power, I think that what informs our practice, of course, we're historical materialists, and we think that there is a basis for this that is rooted in the struggle to produce and reproduce real life, economic activity, etc. And that we always say that let's overturn white power, overturn imperialism, then we can create universities just the basic thing is to look into the genetic question. But let's first take the power, win our freedom, and I don't know of any group that's ever won their freedom through an army of geneticists, or priests for that matter. I think what has to happen is you win your power, and then you can pray when you want to, how you want to, etc., and you can study all kinds of genetic stuff. That's what has to happen. I want to just really appreciate, the comrade who just contacted us from Occupy Tanzania. That was not a small thing that he was talking about how at home, even today in what they call South Africa, we are not Africans, but we are Zulu and various other ethnic entities that have been locked into this place since the white power imposed this relationship on us. So, it presupposes that ethnic groups would never disappear, and they will. They are going to disappear. Or if they don't disappear absolutely, what will happen is that they're going to become extremely minimized. And the reason how do we know they will disappear? How can I say that? What practical, real example can I give that ethnic identities will disappear? And, well, what about Brazil? What about this country that we live in today, where who we identify has been forged through the whole economic relationships that we have here? The ethnic identities become minimized. People came here as Fulani, and people came here as various other ethnic groups and what have you, but those things have disappeared. And it's not just because they said, don't say Toby. I mean, even if we had remained Toby, Toby would have been modified to, the Kunta Kinte would have been changed to be something else that probably would have brought in, other languages from Africa. And we see that already in Africa. We can see those of us, people like Comrade Louisa Kinshasa, who study some of this language things, we can find the root of African languages. You can find all over Africa, with different pronunciations and different this and that. So, Uhuru. Is there anyone else? I want to say that one thing that's really important about this study, what we've done, what we've been doing, what we're doing with our Congress, is that these are really high-level potent discussions that are usually the province of the African petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie proper. We have quoted people like Brzezinski and Fukuyama and others who are counsels to governments and things like that. This is not a discussion that we are supposed to be having within the African working class. I was in occupied Tanzania, South Africa, I think it was in April. And I remember speaking in this one place, Everton, I think it was. And there was in a place where there was no electricity and what have you, and a comrade brother stood up and he appreciated the fact that I would even come to speak in those circumstances to those Africans, but that's who we are. That's the group, that's the revolution. That's where it is. That's the source of the power of the people, that we just don't have possession of it yet. And this is what we're doing now. We are creating revolutionary intellectuals, taking theory and philosophy down from these places up in the sky and bringing it down to earth to the African working class, and so that we make it function in our own interests, and we help to shape and mold what theory looks like based on our connections to the world. That's what's really important about this. And then our Congress will have all these African working class forces who will come together to this Congress, and then they take it back out to the world to spread it, everywhere. Somebody once talked about the specter of communism, where the specter of African internationalism is what we are talking about now, and then what will come out of the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. And I know that you have something to do, and I'm in the way. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Appreciate the study, Chairman, and another round of applause for the study.
Uhuru to Kenya, comrades in Kenya, the Caribbean. Go ahead, comrade.
Yeah, we got comrades listening from all over the world. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, winning the war of ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com and tune in for the next Sunday's O'Malley Taught Me study, where we will conclude this special series with a Q&A webinar. If while tuning in you had major questions throughout the 12-week series, Chairman O'Malley Yesatela will be answering them then. So don't miss it. Your questions might just air on next Sunday's show. The studies go live from Chairman O'Malley Yesatela's Facebook like page, the Burning Spear TV YouTube page, and is broadcasted on Black Power 96.3 FM at 7 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Eastern. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune in to Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasted out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard, and you want to learn more about how can you get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org. That's apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. The 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party will be October 6th through the 12th in St. Louis, Missouri, and is themed Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution. A part of the historic event will be the Black Power Masquerade Ball with cultural performances, dancing, best dressed contest, and silent auction. All around the Congress and banquet can be found at apsp.congress.org. Again, that's apsp.congress.org. Register today and Vanguard up. Uhuru. Join the Freedom Mass Choir. The Freedom Mass Choir is an all-African community choir that sings songs of resistance and revolution. The choir will also be performing at the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. Members are located throughout the United States and attend weekly rehearsals, both in person and via live stream. and video. Sign up by emailing blackpowerchoir@gmail.com or call 727-537-6736. Again, 727-537-6736. On November the 3rd and 4th, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations will be conducting its annual march, rally, and conference in Washington, D.C. This march is appropriately themed, "There is no peace, Africa and Africans are at war. U.S. To the world. Comply or die." More information about this event can be found at blackisbackcoalition.org, blackisbackcoalition.org. And the last announcement is December 9th through the 16th. Come cruise with us aboard the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, a time for revolutionaries to kick back and relax. You'll be on board with Chairman Omali Satella while getting to enjoy the spoils of the ship. Destinations include Grand Cayman, Mahogany Bay, Belize, and Cozumel, Mexico. Get signed up today at uhurulegacycruise.org, and this cruise also serves as a fundraiser for the African Socialist International. Uhuru. Vanguard up.